The story of a people torn from their homeland, scattered to the winds, and wandering for centuries before returning to reclaim what was lost. Few narratives are as powerful, as emotionally charged, and as politically consequential. This account of Jewish exile at the hands of the Romans has been told and retold for generations, shaping identities, fueling ideologies, and defining historical memory. But what if the story we think we know never truly happened? What if the very foundation of this narrative was built not on fact, but on myth carefully crafted centuries after the events it claims to describe? The claim is simple yet staggering. Rome expelled the Jews, creating the diaspora, and only in modern times did the Jewish people return to restore what was taken. It resonates because it ties suffering with redemption, exile with return, injustice with justice. And yet, when we look closely at the historical record, cracks begin to form. The evidence tells a different story, one that is far more complex, far more human, and in many ways far more fascinating than the myth itself. The Roman-Jewish wars of the 1st and 2nd centuries were devastating. There's no doubt about that. Ancient writers describe Jerusalem in flames, entire cities razed, and bodies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Josephus and Cassius Dio record staggering figures, millions dead, tens of thousands enslaved. Even if those numbers are inflated, the brutality of Rome's response is undeniable. And yet amidst this bloodshed, one detail is conspicuously absent. There is no mention of a mass deportation, no organized exile that scattered the Jewish people across the world. Instead, what we find is something quite different. At the time of Rome's conquest, Jews were already spread across the Mediterranean, thriving in cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome itself. In fact, scholars estimate that as much as half, if not more, of the Jewish population lived outside Judea before the wars ever began. These were not refugees, but emigrants who had sought opportunity in trade, politics, and culture. They built synagogues, established communities, and flourished as part of the cosmopolitan fabric of the Roman world. So, if there was no grand exile, what happened to those who remained in Judea? The answer is both tragic and revealing. Many were killed in the wars, others enslaved and absorbed into the empire, and still others quietly remained in Galilee and beyond. Over centuries, through waves of conquest, religion, and empire, those communities shifted, converted, and adapted. Some became Christians, later Muslims, and their descendants still live in the same land their ancestors once did. This picture stands in stark contrast to the myth of total expulsion. But myths are not born without purpose. They serve needs, give meaning, and shape collective memory. The question then becomes, if Rome did not expel the Jews, where did this story come from, and why has it endured so powerfully? The answer lies not in the 1st century, but in the 15th. In 1492, Spain fell to Christian forces, and its Jewish community, one of the most vibrant in the world, faced annihilation. Half were forcibly converted, half expelled, and countless others murdered. It was a catastrophe of unparalleled scale for Jewish life. In its aftermath, Jewish scholars sought to explain, to rationalize, and to find meaning in the trauma. They reached back to Rome, reframing its wars not as brutal defeats, but as the moment of exile, the origin of dispersion. By doing so, they created a narrative of endurance. The people had been cast out once before, had survived, and would continue to survive. This reframing was brilliant and powerful. It gave Jewish communities across the globe a unifying story of shared suffering and perseverance. It countered Christian claims that exile was divine punishment by recasting it as a historical injustice. It transformed tragedy into resilience, forging a collective identity in the face of relentless persecution. But centuries later, this myth would take on new life with the rise of Zionism. For Zionist leaders, the story of Roman exile was indispensable. It provided a moral foundation. The land had been stolen, the people expelled, and history demanded rectification. To return was not migration, it was restoration. It was not settlement, it was homecoming. In this framing, every stone in Judea, every field in Galilee, became a symbol of righting an ancient wrong. And yet the historical record tells us that the reality was far less dramatic. There was no single cataclysmic expulsion. The diaspora was already centuries in the making, built not on chains and forced marches, but on trade, migration, and opportunity. The ancestors of many modern Jews were not victims of Roman exile, but people who left voluntarily to seek better lives, just like countless other communities in the ancient world. This truth raises uncomfortable questions. If the diaspora was not created by Roman expulsion, what does that mean for the central narrative of return? If the land was never entirely emptied, who are the descendants of those who stayed? And how should we understand the modern conflict when viewed through the lens of myth rather than history? The irony is striking. While Zionist ideology framed itself as correcting an ancient injustice, many of the people displaced in the 20th century were the very descendants of those who had never left. They had endured centuries of conquest, conversion, and empire, maintaining a continuous presence on the land, only to be uprooted by those claiming to restore what was lost. The weight of this irony is difficult to ignore. Still, this is not a story of denial or dismissal. It is a story of human resilience. The Jewish diaspora is no less remarkable because it was not born of exile. And perhaps this is the lesson history offers us. Myths can inspire, but they can also obscure. By looking beyond the myth of Roman exile, we uncover a narrative that is no less meaningful, no less profound. It is the story of a people who chose, who endured, and who adapted. It is also the story of others who stayed, who converted, who changed, yet remained tied to the same soil for millennia. In the end, the Roman exile may never have happened, but the diaspora is real, the suffering is real, and the longing for identity and belonging is universal. By untangling myth from history, we can see the Jewish story not as one of forced displacement alone, but as part of the broader human story of migration, resilience, and survival. And that truth, though less convenient for ideology, is far richer for humanity.